Thank you so much for inviting me here to talk. I'm the only non-psychologist. I'm probably also the only non-American. But I am working on law, and I'm very inspired by psychology. And today I would like to take you to my journey. How did I get towards being interested in psychology? And also to tell you a little bit about what we are going to do with psychology. So I study a big problem, as all of us today are studying big problems. Mine is a problem of how do you build a rule of law? How do you, in a situation where 30 years ago there were hardly any legal institutions, the Ministry of Justice was closed, most lawyers were purged, there were no courts, they were done away with in a Cultural Revolution, there were hardly any laws. How do you go from that in 30 years to a system where rules have been developed, but also to make that one where they actually do something, where they're complied with? So why do Chinese obey the law? This is, of course, not a question that's just relevant for China. It's a question that's relevant for many legal systems. Why do people obey the law? How can we find ways through which we can get people in a more, I would say, efficient way or a more morally sound way to comply with rules? How can we design rules that do that in a better way? So that's what my talk today is about. So let me show you some pictures of China's compliance challenge. I think by now most people know about China's air pollution. Did you also know that China has major water pollution issues? About 200 million Chinese, that's 1 in 6, are severely ill because of drinking polluted water. Soil pollution, other kinds of solid waste pollution, it's a major challenge. About 750,000 people die prematurely in China because of air pollution. If I have to find any way to say that what I'm doing in my research, which has centered for about 14 years on environment, is important, it's just those numbers. And of course, it's not just a Chinese problem. Chinese pollution, according to the US EPA, also blows into California. And that is even a problem. And of course, in the region, it's very much a problem. Another issue that I think even influences more Chinese is land. Chinese people have lost their land without due compensation. 1 in 5 farmers. 1 in 5 farmers, China has 750 million farmers, have lost their land without due compensation. Food safety. What you see here is not only nice food, I like eating this kind of food, street food, but also they happen to be using gutter oil. Gutter oil is oil that is not used in cooking process, but actually used from other process, mechanical process, and used in cooking. It's one of the many issues that can explain to you why so many Chinese are worried about food safety, and also why, if I was one of the 7 people governing China, I would worry about the environment. But probably losing power, it's going to be food. I mean, people and food is a very strong relationship. Also, Chinese people have been very angry when they found out that their top leadership had their own food shipped to them from special organic farms. So if as a modern government where you're developing and you're giving economic growth, you cannot sustain basic food safety, it's a big issue. Of course, environment is as well. Labor. We all have nice laptops from China. I have. Probably the least worst labor problems in China are the ones we know about. Okay, so we all worry about our little apples and the labor conditions there. Has any of you ever visited a Chinese mine? You don't want to know what the labor conditions are there. In Chinese mines, they still have the highest incidence of death related to unsafety. I work a lot in chemical fertilizer factories, other factories in the countryside. That's where you get really bad labor conditions. But again, China has unsafe labor. Second problem with labor is people aren't getting paid. It's a lot of unpaid wages, 30 is long hours, and other kinds of things you can imagine. Finally, we can also think about IP. It's one of the biggest worries for US companies, also other companies. If they go and invest in China, they're going to lose their technology. Also, their products get stolen in the Chinese market. I'm not saying China is unique in that. This happens in many countries. We only have to think about downloading and what teenagers are doing with downloading software. But still, it's a major challenge. Finally, there's corruption. Even though China doesn't score that high in my eyes on the corruption perception index, it's about 60th in the world. So if one is the best, which is Finland sometimes, and it kind of alterates, and the lowest is Nigeria or Indonesia or Bangladesh. China is somewhere in the middle. But if you talk with Chinese, their major concern is corruption. They talk about it all the time. For all of these things, we can say, look, China has made laws. It has. Whereas in the 80s, early 80s or 78, when it started to rebuild its legal system, it just didn't have any rules. I mean, formal legal rules. It had a lot of rules within the Communist Party. Now it has very complex legal rules. If you go to the Long Institute, I have my Chinese language library in the Long Institute building. Just current environmental law is this much. And this is central level, excluding standards. If I would include standards, I would have to walk there. So there's plenty of rules. A couple of years ago, Wu Bangguo, the head of the National People's Congress, China's main legislator, he said, look, we have basically made our legal system. We have the rules. The challenge is implementation. And that is a core challenge. How do you get to make these rules work in practice? I always, when I teach, I bring a legal text. Assume I'm holding the law here. I always ask my students, what am I holding? So they'll say, well, the law, or they'll say, what law? No, look better. What am I holding? At some point, somebody says paper. It's paper. How does paper do anything? That's what my research is about. I want to understand, how does paper, how does this? I mean, I started out as a lawyer really believing that, oh, if I write it down this way and I do it this way, then it will change this and that in reality. I've traveled a lot. So what I did is I started with the paper. I started in the capital in Beijing, where it's made, talked with the people how they made it, what they thought it would make. And then I went all the way down to the countryside. Why did I end up in the countryside? Well, I first interviewed law enforcement officials. I wasn't sure whether I could believe what they said, so I went to factories. It's all about environmental law. And wasn't sure whether the factories were telling the truth, so I went to villages living next to factories. So I ended up really with my feet in the dirt, looking back at Beijing at the law. Then, for instance, I found out that not only environmental law, but I was also studying land rights, that the rules that were made in Beijing, they trickled down, only a little bit came down to the ground. People who didn't even have access to the full law, and they wouldn't read the full thing. So what was happening? So my key question has been, how can we get, if the situation is that most people break rules, how can we break out of this vicious circle of weak enforcement and limited compliance? If most people break the rules, enforcement will be weak. The most important effect of enforcement isn't punishment. All the literature on deterrence shows. It's the certainty of getting punished. It's the certainty of getting caught. So if there's many people breaking rules, this certainty will go down automatically. So that's a very big problem. And then China has the extra problem where all of this happens in what I call a capture-prone governance context. That's a long sentence. What I mean by that is three things. First of all, in China, there's very close state-market ties. You cannot often distinguish the government from companies. So if the government is the one, for instance, that is supposed to enforce environmental rules, it's doing it sort of on its own entities. That's the first problem. Much more difficult, I think, than in the US. Second problem is you have formal and informal rules. So there's the law, and underneath that there's all these kinds of informal rules, informal connections and guanxi between different people, and also party-type rules. Finally, China is an authoritarian state, and it has very limited civil society. And because of that, there's very limited checks and balances outside of the formal system. All of that makes things more difficult. So how do you break out of this? This is the core research question that all my research is about. I'm going to talk about three different things that we've done. The first thing that we've done is, over the last years, we've tried to look at cases where something major was tried in China. First, I looked at enforcement campaigns. These are major national level, political, organized enforcement drives, like the war on drugs in the US or zero tolerance on crime, or things like that. So we looked at their effects. And in the several campaigns that I've studied, both anti-corruption campaigns, food safety campaigns, environment, the conclusion was there's a short-term effect. You see that for short term there's more compliance, but it's very difficult to sustain it because in the longer run there simply isn't enough sustained pressure through these campaigns. It's very difficult for the political center to influence local level enforcement agents for a longer period of time. They simply don't have the resources. Second, people learn from these campaigns that, okay, it's off and on. A very good example is intellectual property rights. How do you know when a campaign is ongoing in China? They are ongoing nearly every day, somewhere. If you know what to look for, you'll see them. If you want to buy your little illegal DVDs, I should say it different. If you want to buy legal DVDs, because there's no shop where you can buy illegal ones, and it's very difficult to actually distinguish legal and illegal DVDs in most shops, you'll find that if you go out to your favorite shop, it's closed. Why is it closed? So one of the shops that I would go to sometimes, not that I ever bought any DVDs, I was just researching. It was located right next to the police station that was going to enforce a particular campaign. And when I went there, they were closed. I went to several others, they were all closed. I went to the shop owner and I said, what's going on? What is happening today? Nothing. I said, are you sure? And I found out later there was a campaign. They all closed for a day. So the police officials who were located right next to this actual bureau, they would look around and they would say, okay, we're doing a campaign, let's check this. Do we see any violation? No, we don't, because they're closed. The next day they open again. So it's short-term effects, it's very ad hoc. We also looked at recentralization, also found limited effect. A recent project, I've looked at multiple regulators. So what happens if we involve citizens in law enforcement? We found that that only works if you increase freedoms of citizens. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to do in China, especially freedom of association, which is a core thing if you want citizens to actually be empowered enough to take a stance. So the second thing I've started to do is to switch things around. I wish I had the kind of PowerPoint techniques of Pete that I could just switch things around. So we try to look at it not from the perspective of the law or the perspective of law enforcement officials, but look at it from the perspective of companies. So if you are a Chinese company or a Chinese citizen, why do you obey rules? Why do you break them? Especially the first question is interesting. Look, in a situation where it seems to be very logical, based on all these variables, to break the law, why would you ever be crazy enough to comply with it? So we selected case studies where we looked at people obeying rules. I'll very briefly explain one to you. Lawyers paying taxes in China. It's not very, it doesn't make sense for a Chinese lawyer to pay taxes. So taxes cost more than they benefit directly, if you make a very direct analysis, especially in China. People have limited support for taxes. When I interviewed lawyers about taxes, they said, look, the government just doesn't like lawyers. They're asking us to pay much more taxes, so they're stealing from us. And they also thought most other people weren't paying taxes. So what we saw is actually that most lawyers that did pay taxes, they saw it as a very high risk. And here's a puzzle. There was no law enforcement. There is virtually no law enforcement on lawyers cheating on taxes. So why do they see a high risk? We found that this comes largely because of the clients and the law firm, but also because they generally are afraid of the government being lawyers in China, and you're much more pressured by the government. So I can give many more examples of the current studies that we're doing. We're looking at food safety in restaurants. We're actually working in restaurants. One of my students is doing anthropological observations, looking at the processes of compliance. How does the paper enter the workplace? Looking at training of people, looking at how it shapes, for instance, compliance with washing of hands rules. China, there's 13 situations under which you should wash your hands in a restaurant if you work there. We're also looking at worker safety in construction industry in China. These huge construction sites where one of my other students is working now. And we just finished a large study of pesticide compliance by Chinese farmers. This brings me to the present. I only have one more minute left, so I have to be short. I found that with all my prior research, which I will continue because it's important, our end conclusions were often, it's more complex than we thought, which I'm very happy with as a scholar. It's normal, but increasingly frustrated with as a human being. I want to look at these problems and try and solve them. So we're trying increasingly to see, are there ways in which, or new ways outside of these large institutional frameworks, outside these things that are very difficult to change, are there other thoughts? And I found psychology offers a lot of ideas and also methods, especially the experimental method, where one can try and see whether there's ways in which to improve compliance with the law. I'll give you one very simple example. There's a scholar called Dan Ariely. He and his group study cheating and lying, and they've mainly studied people in the US. And they had one idea where, okay, if we get people to sign a pledge to promise that they won't lie, how long will that reduce lying amongst people? And they found, well, it works for a while. It doesn't work for a long run. Okay, that's interesting, but not so much for my research. Then they did a follow-up study, and they looked at insurance fraud. And they said, okay, based on this idea, if we find that insurance forms are wrong, if we get people to sign at the top to promise that they will not lie on the form, instead of at the bottom when they've already filled it out, maybe we can decrease insurance fraud. And they found they could decrease it. This, for me, is one example of a particular form of compliance where we can find a different way of working on it. So we're now working with Pete and with Beth and with Chuan Sheng, who's also on the faculty here, and with Nick Scourge, to find ways in which to carry out experiments. On the one hand, to find better solutions. The other hand is, what are the cultural differences? Are Chinese different in how they respond to sanctions than Americans? What does that mean then for laws in the US and in China? What does it mean for businesses that have to manage compliance when they're working in the US and in China? I want to leave it at that, and thank you very much.